Hello everyone, so Matt Easton here again, Scholar Gladiatoria. A few days ago, about a week ago, I put up a video about the Eastern Gymnasium Sabre, which is one of these. I thought off the back of that I would just say something about the original Gymnasium Sabres, what they are essentially. So to put things in context, and if you've got a background in sport fencing, so a modern sport fencing sabre is a part of a line of development that comes from a gymnasium sabre. This here is the 1864 pattern British gymnasium sabre. You can see it's slightly curved, got a great big guard on it, and importantly, comparing it to a modern sport sabre, it weighs around 800 grams, 850 grams. A modern sport fencing sabre weighs up to about 500 grams. I think the limit that the FIE makes for sport fencing sabres is 500 and something grams. I can't remember the exact amount. But most of them in use are more like 400 grams. So in reality this weapon is twice as heavy as a sport fencing sabre. But there's an even more important difference than just that fact alone. And that's that with this weapon, there's, just like with a real sabre, there's a lot of weight in the blade. With a modern sport fencing sabre, the point of balance is very, very close to the hand, and actually a lot of the weight is in the hilt. So it's a completely different handling weapon, and it hits a lot harder, obviously, so you have to wear more protective gear, as we do, but most importantly it handles like a real sabre. And that's the important thing, and that's why we use them, because they are the Victorian practice weapon for fencing to prepare you for fighting with a real sword. And whilst you can learn the principles and the basics of real military sabre fencing with a modern sport weapon, in a way you can't, because the weapon is so far removed from the real sabre that it changes many of the dynamics. I'll also make another video talking about how you cut as well. So in modern sport fencing, a touch, you're just aiming to make an electrical circuit to touch the opponent. When you're actually aiming to cut with the weapon, it changes a lot of things, how you move the weapon, what we would class in HEMA as a scoring hit, and so on. But just going back to the gymnasium weapons, so to set the scene, essentially, single stick was the normal practice weapon for backsword in the 18th century. And when sabres sort of took over from spadroons and backswords in around 1800 in the Napoleonic Wars, they started to play with, those who could afford it, started to play with blunt, flexible practice weapons of sabres. And I should also mention that foils, which were heavier than modern foils, were used as practice weapons for spadroons. So when sabres took over from spadroons, they needed a new practice weapon, and initially they used single sticks predominantly. And of course single stick is an ash stick with a leather or a basket guard, and it's relatively cheap, quite disposable, fairly safe. However, by the middle of the 19th century, by the sort of 1840s, 1850s, in many European countries, but in Britain, there was a demand for better quality steel practice weapon, and that essentially gave rise to this thing. And there were several unofficial versions before this regulation, standard weight, standard length, standard curvature, everything came out in 1864. Interestingly, there was also an 1864 pattern foil for foil fencing as well. And I should mention that foil fencing in the military at that time was taught purely as a gymnastic exercise. And although it taught some principles that could be used in swordsmanship, i.e. sabre, or broadsword as it was also known, to differentiate from smallsword, the foil was really seen as a sport, and sabre was seen as a military, as a martial art, as a military activity, along with bayonet as well. So the 1864 pattern came along, and this, and I have another one here, this one, pretty much match exactly. They're both pretty much spot on 800 grams each, just under 2 pounds, which I should mention matches quite closely to the actual military weapon that they were simulating. So you'll see that the lengths of the blade and the hilt are pretty much identical between an infantry officer's weapon, this is actually a foot artillery officer's sword, and the practice weapon. The guard is more substantial on the gymnasium sabre to protect the hand, and also it's symmetrical, so it could be used by a left or right-handed person, and it gives more protection to the hand for fencing. This guard is, whilst it is protective, it's also they're also considering having to wear the weapon all day, and obviously they don't use the swords very often, so wearing the weapon is actually quite an important factor, as it was in all periods. But you'll see the length and the curvature and the weight is the same, the point of balance is the same, and therefore the feeling in the hand is the same. Throughout the 19th century, the gymnasium sabre developed. It, generally speaking, moved in a line that went towards the modern sport weapons. So by the end of the 19th century, by the 1890s, the regulation sword for infantry officers in the British Army had changed to a straight thrusting sword, and therefore what we call the sabre became straight, and that's essentially why the modern fencing sabre is straight, because both in France and England, which were the two key countries for developing sport fencing rules around 1900, 1910, they basically brought in straight swords for infantry officers, so that's why the so-called modern sport fencing sabre is straight. And interestingly, those practice weapons were designed, much like a foil, to be good for thrusting, because both the French infantry officer's sword and the British infantry officer's sword were thrusting weapons. So in a way, the modern sport fencing sabre doesn't really represent a cut and thrust sword at all, and it was never meant to. However, in the modern sport, there's this idea that that's what it's supposed to represent, but it doesn't. So this is the gymnasium sabre, and if you want to do military sabre fencing, you have something like this. And there were different designs in different countries, but I'm just using the British one because I have a couple of originals. These are both original examples. One's made by Mole of Birmingham, don't know who the other one's made by, but they're essentially identical. But something I would like to show also is this curious example, which I came across very recently. It's actually made by Wilkinson, famous Wilkinson of Pall Mall, and it is actually very narrow, put it next to the normal one, and very curved and longer than normal. But you'll notice the hilt is absolutely identical. The guard is the same width, the same size, the grip's the same. The only slight difference is that the pommel nut is smaller because of course this is a lighter blade and this is a heavier blade, so the pommel nut acts to counterbalance the blade. And so far I don't really know what niche this fulfills and what it was for. Maybe it was an early sort of fun sport weapon, or maybe it was for an officer, special order, who preferred a lighter sword, perhaps a longer, more curved sword. Just don't know, probably we'll never know. But it's an interesting example of something that's based on a regulation standard gymnasium sabre, but with a different type of blade. And incidentally, this weighs 700 grams. So even this narrow thing that looks almost like a sport weapon is still considerably heavier than a modern sport fencing sabre. So for now, that's all I'll say about gymnasium sabres and sport fencing sabres, but parting comment is just to say that modern sport sabre is in many ways different from military sabre, and this is just one example of how it's very different. The weapons are very different, and they change the way that you fight. Thank you very much. Cheers.